fellow members, Prester John. Who's heard of him? Where did you hear from him?
In a John Buchan novel, I think.
Right, yes. Load of rubbish, but still. Okay, so that is generally where you hear of Prester John Buchan. It's not like that at all. Prester John first surfaced in the 12th century. He was this exotic king and priest living somewhere far, far east of Asia. Nobody knew where, but he had an incredible reputation of having a castle, well, not a castle, it was a building that took a whole day to walk round, to get round to the other side of it. He had gold everywhere, he had jewels everywhere, he had a green emerald sceptre, and he had armies that beat everybody in the area. So Prester John was somebody to reckon with. He was something. Now, in Europe at the time, the 12th century, they had a serious problem because the Muslims were sort of beating them up and taking back Jerusalem and generally causing havoc in the Promised Land, Jerusalem. So the bishop from Syria, who actually is interesting, Syria and the rest of them, East Christians, were Nestorian. They were basically heretics, but they were a kind of Christian. And so one of their bishops from Syria came down and he said, well, you know, I've heard that Prester John, he's got 3 armies lined up to come over and help in Jerusalem. So they thought, okay, that sounds good, let's get another crusade going. So they organised a crusade and Prester John was supposed to come. Now, story goes that Prester John had a problem. He couldn't get across the Tigris, it was just too big and there were no bridges. And he couldn't get across. So he thought, okay, go north. If we go north, the water will freeze and we can walk across that way. Nah, it didn't freeze. So in the end, because of all the illness, his troops had to go back home. And so he sent a message saying that this is what happened to the bishop of Syria, and he passed it on. So they weren't that upset, but they just felt that maybe next time he could get it right. So what was the next crusade? Now this crusade, the next one, the Children's Crusade, have you heard of that? Children's Crusade? Well, there were 2 lots. One lot were up sort of Derby way, and the other lot came from the London end. And they had about 20,000 kids, with a few adults, marching on Jerusalem. Well, you can't march direct really, so they got boats and ended up in Italy. Now the Italians got really pissed off with all this. 20,000 children who couldn't speak Italian and who wanted their food. Big problem. So what happened? Well, they rounded them up and sold them as slaves. So these children didn't have a really good time. Some of them managed to get Jerusalem, and saw the Pope, who said, "No, you're a bit too young for this. Go home." And they were really annoyed, because they put all this effort in to get there, and the Pope just told them, "Go away, you're too young." Anyway, back to Prester John, because he was the one who was going to do this, sort them out in Jerusalem. And what they said was, well, you've got to get this in perspective. Prester John obviously comes from the same place that the Magi came from, the 3 kings, because they come from somewhere where we don't know. It's in the Bible, but it didn't say where they came from. Must be where Prester John is, because that is the place. And so now it becomes a biblical thing that in the Bible it says. So Prester John's got his little bit in the Bible. So Prester John sort of disappears a bit, don't hear him back for a while. They thought he was in Asia, far Asia, but things that were happening gave the impression that maybe he was in Africa. So they came up with Abyssinia. So he was king of Abyssinia. Not really. By the time the Europeans had got to Abyssinia, they realised he was just a nothing type king. It wasn't Prester John at all. Then they thought maybe India. And they were trying to get into India, and what they saw in India, no Prester John. China. China became the one that they thought really big, because it's so far over. Yeah, that's got to be the place. Meantime, a letter arrived to the Pope and Barbarossa, who was the emperor, Holy Roman Emperor he was, and I can't remember who the third one was, but there were three of them, and they got this letter from Prester John, and he was talking about the fact that he was a Christian, and he wanted to build a church in Rome, and he wanted to make his followers all into the Western style Christianity, because he felt that the Eastern style was not very good and didn't fit in with his image, so he wanted to get this sorted, and they were going to do it. So what happened next? Marco Polo turns up. Now, come on, this is centuries afterwards. But Marco Polo turns up and says he's met Prester John. Okay, so he met him and said that he was, not as powerful as he thought he would be, but yes, he was a king and he was a priest and he had a lot of following, and he's got a good army. That was all he said. Well, Marco Polo was lying, because nobody has ever met Prester John. Prester John and his descendants, King David being one of them, did not ever exist. They're a complete fiction created by the church to justify the East coming across and helping the West defeat Islam and anybody else who got in the way. So Prester John, you could look him up, and I've got a whole pile of notes there, which actually I've done quite well. I remembered most of it. And he was not somebody that you could believe in at all. And yet, there were so many copies. Remember the letter I told you about? There were over 300 copies of that letter in various languages sent to all of the bishops, because they truly believed that Prester John would help them. And of course he couldn't. And there's all these people lining their pockets from getting this fictitious Prester John to be the man that they all show their allegiance to by giving him money to show how much they thought of him.